Welcome to Atheist Talk. I'm your host, Grant Steeves, and in this program we are going to be discussing the word atheism in greater depth in terms of the language usage of it, some of its history and background, and trying to find out the meaning for atheists in terms of its application. At times, this program could get philosophical, and that means more depth in looking at the term and its application. Joining me for this discussion are three individuals from the Minnesota Atheists. One is the board member and a secretary of the organization, is George Kane. Next is Jeannette Watland, and she's a member of the board as well, and James Zimmerman, who is a member and co-editor of the newsletter for Minnesota Atheists. And I welcome you to this program.
Thank you.
The question that will come up at this point in terms of the differences was, when we look at atheism, there are people who take what is in terms of philosophy or professional atheists, maybe we could call them, strong or weak positions. What is the difference between a strong and a weak atheist? And give me some depth of clarification for this one, I think.
All right, I can respond to that.
Yes, thank you, George.
A strong atheist briefly holds the position that there are no supernatural gods, whereas a weak atheist, based upon atheism meaning a without theism belief in gods, just says, I have no God beliefs. I have no opinion in that regard. Now, largely the reason for making this distinction is a matter of the issue of burden of proof. That theists want to say, well, if you're an atheist, prove it. Prove that there are no gods. You'd have to look everywhere, which I think is a pretty silly position. So people take the weak atheist position and say, well, I just don't have any beliefs. I don't have anything to prove. If you want to prove there are gods, you have to prove it to me. I think it's a silly argument, really, from the standpoint that you should be prepared in a discussion to prove whatever position it is that you're claiming. Now, there's also strong and weak with regard to agnosticism, which refers to not belief but knowledge. A weak agnostic says, I don't know if there are any gods, but maybe somebody else does, or maybe we'll know in the future. Whereas a strong agnostic says, I don't know if there are any gods, and neither do you. Now, I'm a strong atheist and a weak agnostic.
Okay.
But the term weak atheist is probably closer to the original definition because, as George mentioned, the a means without. Just like if you say you're apathetic about politics, it doesn't mean you're against politics. It just means you don't care to discuss it, you're not interested in it, you don't know the candidate's viewpoints. So you could almost say that weak atheism equals atheism, strong atheism equals anti-theism, a newer word that's been coined to express a stronger viewpoint.
There's also apatheism,
Right.
Yeah.
which refers to the apathetic position you were describing.
The first person that I ever encountered as an atheist was a librarian at the university, and I used to have discussions with her about her atheism, and I was rather fundamentalist at the time, and I encountered her 40 years later by sheer chance at the University of Minnesota at a women's conference, and I was there visiting, and I went up to her and I said, you know, I've become an atheist. I've changed my 180 degrees in life. She says, oh, atheism. She says, I'm not even interested in the term anymore. But she still is an atheist. She just doesn't, it's not something she even thinks is worthy of discussion.
Sure. And people do go through nuanced changes like that. I know that 40 years ago when I was in college, I really reached the atheist conclusion. But I didn't really think of myself as an atheist. I just thought the question wasn't important.
And even when you began to look at certain groups, for example, a Buddhist may be considered an atheist.
James.
And Jainist, that there are certain groups which in the West we consider religions, but we wouldn't consider atheism, at least for us, we don't see ourselves as a religion, do we?
Well, there are some atheists who try to derive certain benefits. There is a group in Texas that calls itself the First Church of Atheism or something like that, in order to get some benefits they feel that are given to churches that a simple 501c3 educational group wouldn't have.
And wasn't there an attempt at least maybe in the 70s to have, maybe it was the term humanism by the Supreme Court, define it so that it is a religion? That there were cases that were brought that tried by fundamentalists to get it described as a religion, and therefore we would be more subject to certain rules and regulations or censures.
Of course, it depends on the individual case. You know, that by calling it a religion, it would qualify adherence to the benefits of the First Amendment of freedom of religion. So there could be that sort of usage too. But you'd have to look at the individual cases.
Okay. Well, we have gone a bit afield from strong and weak atheism, but it clearly, there is a division within the atheist movement in the United States. There are books which get into this. There's an author, I believe he's English, Michael Martin, and he has a book on the justification for atheism, philosophical justification of atheism, and half of the book deals with strong and half deals with weak.
Right. I'd interject to say that I really don't think there's a division. People argue atheism in different ways. I don't think that there's what I would call a division within the community. I think that atheism, unlike religions, doesn't have leaders.
Right.
And I know that a lot of writers have, and Christians especially, have referred to the new atheism and think that claim that it's defined by the leaders whom they say are Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, and that you know what atheists believe today by quoting from these people. Well, that's not true at all. No. Most atheists, in fact, disagree with Hitchens and Harris, especially, just about every time they speak. There are things that we agree with them on, but certainly no one would call them a leader whom I agree with just on the basis of his position of authority. Maybe
that old saying that we're like herding cats.
That's right.
That atheists are rather independent-minded, science-oriented. We could say that those things are true, and have thought about a lot of issues, and therefore come to different conclusions. But we are united in a non-belief, I guess is the way I could put it. So within the Minnesota atheists, one of the questions that came up, because it is mentioned in our newsletter that we are a force for positive atheism in action. And strong atheism and weak atheism has also been noted as positive and negative. Now, we get into a bit of a mix that needs to be clarified, and I think the historian philosopher is going to do that.
Okay, I can speak to that.
Thank
there
you.
are different uses of the terms positive and negative, and in fact, it is used at times to be nearly identical to the strong-weak distinction. But also, positive atheism is just, I think, a laudatory term. It's something that a cheerleader for atheism might say, that we're positive atheists. We are, a good force for the community. We are strong people in our dedication to do good and for the community and all of that. So I think that it's one of those terms where you just have to see in context which way it's being used.
Okay. And it appears that as it is used in our newsletter, it is attitudinal, that it's looking at the attitude that we have towards atheism and the presentation of atheism to the public in Minnesota, that we wanted a positive image, not a negative or something that people will look at and think, oh, they really are evil.
I've also heard it called friendly atheism. I think that's a less confusing term.
Friendly atheism.
Friendly atheism.
The FFRF gives out an award, I think, every year for the Friendly Neighborhood Atheist.
I think positive atheism is used in the newsletter also just to separate the organization from atheism, a term just by itself, because the term almost always with religious people carries a negative term because you're expressing what you don't have or don't believe in. So by putting a positive spin on it, by putting the word positive literally on it, we're trying to make it a force for good.
Even the words in action, I think that actually connotates that we're doing something and we're not just atheists that sit around. We're actually doing things in the community.
It really helps in terms of the image for the Minnesota atheists. So this has been a term, though, that has been applied to the Minnesota atheists from its founding, which would be, what, 40 years ago, roughly? 30 years ago.
I wasn't around then.
You weren't around then, were you?
Nor was I.
But from its inception, as I understand, that the idea of positive atheism was associated with it. And when we join the organization and we get a clarification of that term, I think that we move forward in a positive way. We learn something about it in terms of its application in the community. That I don't see people within the atheist community here that are railing against religion. Well, once in a while I do. But mostly people are much more friendly in how they approach it. They'll disagree with you, but that doesn't mean they're going to slay the dragon attitude. Quite different. Now, in terms of the atheist position, and we come back now more to the strong and the weak atheist, we look at it in terms of what are some of the assumptions that an atheist must make to believe in atheism, to be an atheist. Are there assumptions?
Well, I believe that atheism is, for most atheists, an empirical conclusion.
Okay.
That it's not a belief, because beliefs held on faith really cannot be contradicted. Whereas I think every atheist will say, well, if I'm wrong, and a God shows up and appears in the sky and speaks to everyone in the world at the same time, and this is recorded on televisions and everything, and everyone hears it in his own language, something like that. You know, of course you admit I was wrong. You know, so there's no faith there. We're awaiting further evidence, and so far there's no credible evidence of a God, and so it's an empirical conclusion. I mentioned in a previous program that it's very much like the conclusion that there is no cold fusion. We look at it, we try to make it work, and if it doesn't work, we have to move on.
But just as there's no non-cold fusion organization, because there's not a large body of people who believe in cold fusion all around the earth, but because there's a large body of people that believe that God or a sort of God does exist, then the term atheism has come into play to differentiate from that.
Okay. I think it's worthwhile going back to the notion, the empirical, that this is a scientific approach. That we, as one of the books which I would recommend, and we're going to get through, as we go through this, we're going to get to other recommendations. This is a book by an anthropologist entitled Natural Atheism, David Eller. And he has a chapter, and when George talked about the issue of belief, this is one of the things that Eller spends a chapter on, in which he talks about knowing is not believing. And I thought it was an important chapter, that so often we use a word loosely, and that when it comes down to the definition of atheism, that empiricism, the empirical method, is key to our understanding of what our position is.
Right. There's an ambiguity in the word belief. It's used in certainly two different senses. Belief is used to mean something that I hold on faith, and it's also used simply to indicate that it's something, the truth of which I affirm.
Well, when I think of a person of faith, I think of them as having two basic assumptions from which they work. One is that God exists, and they don't spend a great deal of time trying to prove it because in some ways they acknowledge they can't do it empirically. And the other is that the Bible is the sort of the inherent word of God, that this is God speaking to man in the Christian sense. Atheists do not have a comparable approach, do they?
No, there is no atheist's Bible that makes any claims to which every atheist would have agreed.
Right.
But I would argue that all atheists, just like all humans, get their morality from the same place, and that is the human mind. In effect, Christians, even though they say that morality comes from the Bible, they know this because they have to try and find ways to work around the awkward things in the Bible. Like if you want to embarrass a Christian, ask them about how Elisha called for some she-bears to tear up children because they made fun of his baldness, or bring up some of the more embarrassing stories. And why doesn't that sit well with them? I mean, it obviously fits the morality of the Bible.
If you start discussing ethics and morality, then clearly there's a distinction between atheists and theists. Since theists believe that what is good is divinely declared, right, that it's good because God says it's good. Mm-hmm. Atheists can get their moral grounding in a number of different ways, but one thing that definitely follows from their position is that morality is not God-declared. Mm-hmm. An atheist can be a conventionalist, an atheist can follow any of several teleological systems, such as utilitarianism. An atheist can be a rationalist. There are many possible forms of ethics that would be attractive to an atheist and compatible with the conclusion that there is no God. Mm-hmm.
I think the beautiful thing about atheism is that there's no dogma, and each atheist is unique and has their own personal philosophies.
In that sense, then, for an atheist, certainty doesn't exist. It is doubt.
And yes, I think that doubt is an inescapable attribute of the human condition. Certainly, I think that doubt is critical in discussions of ethics. For a teleologist who thinks that the basis for evaluating moral good is the consequences of an action, then you're stuck in the human predicament that we don't have crystal balls. Mm-hmm. We can make predictions based upon available facts and the best reasoning that we can apply to it, but we don't know. Mm-hmm. So that for any form of teleological ethicist, you can do the best you can, but whatever you choose may in the end turn out to be wrong.
And so when we've discussed science, and we've noted that science is that field of endeavor in which nothing is 100%, that they have always allowed the element of doubt, and that for an atheist we live with doubt, and that's the only thing we're certain of, I guess, that it is a position which I think makes it very difficult for some people who are fundamentalists or religious, because they don't live with doubt. They have this certainty in their faith, and they can't see how you can possibly walk through life with this element of uncertainty.
One reason they are religious is because of the comfort that the answers that they found brings them.
Mm-hmm. When we were discussing prayer in the earlier program, one of the comments one of the scientists made is the only time that prayer is successful is when the person is doing it themselves. Because like the placebo effect, you can build it into yourself that this is going to work, this is going to work, and if you repeat it often enough, it may work. But otherwise, it hasn't been too successful. And that is empirical. That's one of those things that we can prove, though probably there are many people that would deny it as well. So in terms of getting at another element of the philosophy of atheism, we were talking about the materialist. The empirical is the approach, the discovery. The materialist is more of a description. And how does that fit into the notion of an atheist? if you're a materialist?
Right. Materialism is an ontological position that can't be absolutely proved. But I think a materialist would beat down the arguments of dualists who hold to a mind-matter distinction, or those who hold that material existence could not exist without some supernatural reality sustaining it, such as Bishop Berkeley argued with respect to the view of God that things only exist because God perceives them all the time and have continuity.
Yes, the latest research in neuroscience in particular has, I think Steven Pinker is one of the major authors in this area of language and the study of the human mind in terms of the duality. And by the time you finish reading Pinker, if you still believe in duality, you didn't read him, because the evidence is overwhelming. The empirical evidence is overwhelming. And there is an author who is also a neuroscience, Ramachandran, who has done the same kind of approach, that he recognizes through empirical evidence that the brain, it's not two elements here, that it is one, and that we have to learn to live with this. Mm-hmm. And those of people who have gone through mental illness, I think they come to a better understanding of that it's a physical thing. So maybe this is a difference in understanding.
Right. You frequently hear Christians say something like, well, we can't know what happens after death. Well, actually, we do. We have doctors who've determined how consciousness works, tied it to brain functions. We can measure those brain functions very clearly, and we know that when brain activity stops, consciousness ends. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, so that bit of doubt, false doubt, is just opening the door so as to allow them to sneak in a God conclusion.
Well, it is not always easy, to say the least, to explain it to many people, fundamentalists in particular, I think, but to the general public when we encounter them, to correct or to try to help them understand atheism in a different way, like I think we're attempting this evening. And yet, when you come up against a hardcore believer with certainty, do we turn the other cheek? This is a very Christian thing to do, but it's also part of the culture that we've grown up with. Is that something that an atheist would do?
Well, I am one who enjoys going online to discussion boards and debating topics with Christians. But there's a difference between Christians and atheists in that Christians have this divine calling, this commandment from God to spread the faith of Christianity, whereas atheists are not looking to save anybody's soul. There are things that pretty much every atheist wants to argue for, such as issues of separation of church and state.
Right.
And so we want to have some political effect in certain areas. But yeah, we do not have an individual compulsion to argue or to correct or to be abrasive or anything like that.
I've actually seen, I've actually seen blogs where there are atheist blogs and there'll be Christians on there, and atheists are so rude, and they will say, you're wrong, you're wrong, I'm right, you're stupid for believing this. And I think that both sides can be just as offensive, and I don't think either side really turns the other cheek.
I think that's a climate that's common to all blogs, or the ones that I've seen. There is an all-atheist website, Atheist Nexus, and some of the people there are just so belligerent when you're talking to people who agree with you about 99% of the topic.
Preaching to the choir.
I know atheists will talk about it to each other, like in certain student groups, they will sit there and say how wrong Christians and religious people are, and they say that with such certainty.
Well, that comes back to that dogmatic attitude which seems to be part of the human condition, I think, at times, that we want to believe our beliefs. We want to think that what we have in our mind is certain, even though we have doubt.
You're talking yourself into it.
We talk ourselves into it, is right. So we've looked at more of a philosophical approach to atheism, and at the end of the program I had mentioned that we would like to talk about some of the books that perhaps we could recommend for people to look at when they're exploring the idea of atheism. And we'll start with George.
Well, just one that I read recently, read just a few months ago, that is very short, very readable, has instances of humor. It's easy to follow, surprisingly easy to follow. Is by an author named John Allen Paulus. And John Allen Paulus has written another book, which was a bestseller in the New York Times list, in Numeracy. But this book is called Irreligion. A mathematician discusses why all the arguments for the existence of God just don't add up.
Okay.
And I highly recommend it. It's an easy read.
Could we move? We have to move along
I
here.
have 3 friendly atheists, or this is a friendly atheist book. I sold my soul on eBay. It was very appealing to me. I then read Spook when I got freaked out that there was no afterlife, and this talks about what happens after you die scientifically. And then Man's Search for Meaning, Holocaust survivor, talks about how to find good in the world in a secular way.
Okay.
I would recommend Atheist Universe by David Mills. I don't have a copy of it, but that gives an excellent worldview, answers a lot of arguments people have for atheism. And then if you're more into the internet, atheistgeeknews.com provides a humorous take on one man's journey into atheism.
Okay, thank you. I will go back and put a plug in for Natural Atheism by David Eller. Once again, I think it's an excellent introduction. And he has followed this up with a newer book entitled Atheism Advanced. And this has greater depth, more philosophical distinctions and arguments that are presented. Well, that makes some recommendations, and we want to thank you for listening. And it comes to the end of this program. If you're interested in us, you may contact us at the numbers and the website that are on the screen, and we will send you a free copy of the Minnesota Atheist newsletter. It's important also that in contacting us that you let us know if there are topics you're interested in. Because after all, if you're interested in us, we're interested in you. And thank you for listening.